Ruth Calloway's back hit the wall of Harmon's General Store so hard the shelves rattled, and Arthur Calloway's gloved hand came down flat against the wood beside her face. Not touching her, never touching her. He was too smart for that. But close enough that she could smell the cold leather and the cigar smoke and the particular scent of a man who had never once been told no and intended to keep it that way. "You have until tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "The children come with me, or I take this to a territorial judge and you lose them in a courtroom instead. Your choice, Ruth. Make a smart one." Behind her, through the thin wall, she could hear Josie laughing at something. Henry's small boots on the floorboards. Clara's voice, careful and low, the way it always got when she was trying to manage a situation she didn't fully understand. 3 children. Her children. And this man standing between her and the door. If this story reaches your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Ruth's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The wagon rolled into Silver Creek, Montana, on a Tuesday in December of 1886. And the first thing Ruth Calloway did when she pulled the horse to a stop was look at her children and count them the way she'd counted them every morning for the past 8 months. Not from habit, but from necessity. The way a woman counts the things most likely to be taken from her. Clara, 12 years old, already on her feet on the wagon bench before Ruth could say a word, her eyes moving across the street in quick assessment. Josie, 8, chin lifted, braids half undone from the wind, studying Silver Creek like she intended to have an opinion about it shortly. Henry, 5, pressed into Clara's side, one fist clenched around his sister's coat, saying nothing. 3, all 3. Ruth released the breath she'd been holding since Helena. She climbed down from the wagon, tied the horse to the post outside Harmon's General Store, and walked up the iced-over porch steps like a woman who had planned to be here all along. The bell above the door jangled. Inside, warmth, wood smoke, the smell of dried goods and pine resin. 6 people who all looked up at once, with the particular attention that small towns give to strangers in December. Ruth walked directly to the counter. "I'm looking for the town council," she said. "I understand Silver Creek needs a school teacher." The man behind the counter, gray-bearded, hawk-eyed, unhurried, looked at her. Looked at Clara and Josie and Henry filing in behind her. Looked back at her. "Ed Harmon," he said. "Council meets Thursday evenings." "Today's Wednesday," Ruth said. "It is." A voice came from behind her, sharp, certain. The voice of someone accustomed to being the last word in any room. "Dorothy Marsh. I chair the council." The woman turned from the fabric counter, arms folded. Silver hair pulled so tight it looked like it hurt. Eyes the color of the sky outside, gray and considerably more dangerous. "Who are you, and what are you running from?" The room went quiet. Ruth turned to face her. "Ruth Calloway, 3 years teaching primary school in Helena, 3 before that in St. Louis. References from the Helena District Superintendent." She reached into her coat and set the envelope on the nearest surface. "I'm running from a bad situation toward a better one. Your advertisement said no questions about prior employment." "We don't ask," Dorothy said. "Doesn't mean we don't see." Her eyes moved to the children, back to Ruth. "Husband?" "Dead." "How long?" 8 months. "You drove here from Helena in December." "With 3 children and—" Dorothy glanced at the small bag Ruth had set down. "That?" "Yes." "Why Silver Creek specifically?" Ruth met her gaze. "Because you said no questions about the past." Dorothy Marsh was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked. Wind pressed at the windows. "Those children fed?" Dorothy said. Ruth paused. "They had breakfast." "It's 3 in the afternoon." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a woman who had been surviving on careful arithmetic and pride for 4 days, and was not going to be the one to break first. Henry broke first. He tugged on Ruth's coat, very gently, and when she looked down at him, he pointed at the candy jars behind Ed Harmon's counter without saying a word. Just pointed, his small face absolutely serious, as if he were filing a formal request. Something shifted in Ed Harmon's expression. He reached into the nearest jar and set 3 peppermints on the counter. "First ones are on the house for new folks," he said. Ruth's throat closed. She picked up the peppermints and handed one to each of her children, and did not say thank you, because her voice was not available at the moment. "Sit down," Dorothy Marsh said, not unkindly. "All of you. Ed, is there bread left from this morning?" "Some." "Get it." Ruth started to say she didn't need charity. Dorothy Marsh looked at her with the expression of a woman who had heard that particular sentence before and had no patience for it. "Your children need to eat," Dorothy said. "That's not charity. That's sense. Sit down, Mrs. Calloway." Ruth sat down. While the children ate, Josie immediately and enthusiastically, Clara with careful, deliberate bites, like she was rationing, Henry methodically working through his bread, with his peppermint still clutched in his other fist. Dorothy Marsh read through the references with the concentrated attention of someone who had been deceived before and intended not to be again. "Helena superintendent speaks well of you," Dorothy said. "Says your students tested above district average both years." "They did." "Says you're firm but fair, that you don't play favorites." "I try not to." "Says you had a situation with a parent in your second year. Doesn't give details." Ruth folded her hands on her knees. "A father decided that arithmetic was not a necessary subject for his daughter. I disagreed. He went to the school board. The school board sided with me." Dorothy looked up. "What happened to the father?" "He found another school." Ruth paused. "His daughter came back the following year and tested first in her grade." Something moved in Dorothy's face, barely visible. A door opening a crack. 2 weeks, Dorothy said. "No questions about your past, but you answer to me about your classroom. Parents have concerns, I hear them. You have problems, you bring them to me. You don't solve things sideways. Understood?" "Understood." "Room above Briggs's feed store is available. Small." "We've slept in a wagon for 4 nights, Ruth said. "We're not particular." "Monday, 8 o'clock, 14 students. Building's got a stove that draws bad and a blackboard that warps in cold weather. You'll make do." "I'll make do." Dorothy stood, refolded the references, and handed them back. Then she paused. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I've been running this town for 11 years. I've seen people come through Silver Creek with stories and without them, with good reasons and bad ones, with children and alone. I can usually tell the difference between someone hiding something shameful and someone protecting something precious." She looked at Ruth steadily. "I'm not sure yet which one you are, but I'm willing to find out." Ruth held her gaze. "So am I," she said. The door opened then, letting in a blade of cold air. A man stepped inside and stopped to stamp snow from his boots, a gesture so automatic it was clearly habit. And when he pulled off his hat, Ruth saw a face that was neither young nor old, neither handsome nor plain, but honest in a way that was harder to find than either. "Afternoon, Dot." His voice was low and level, the voice of a man who didn't use more of it than necessary. "Ed?" "Will," Dorothy said. "We've got a new teacher. Monday. Mrs. Ruth Calloway." The man named Will looked at Ruth. His eyes were dark brown, steady, unhurried. They moved briefly to Clara, to Josie, to Henry, who had finished his bread and was now staring at the man with the frank, unself-conscious stare of a 5-year-old. "Ma'am," Will said. "Sir," Ruth said. He set a folded paper on the counter, exchanged a few words with Ed Harmon about a supply order, touched the brim of his hat in Ruth's direction, and left. "Will Hargrove," Dorothy said, in the tone of someone providing context they consider necessary, "runs the horse operation north of town. He's on the council. Good man. Fair." Ruth noted the information. She did not respond to it. She was watching Henry, who had gone to the window and was pressing his nose to the glass, watching Will Hargrove walk away through the snow. "Horses," Henry said quietly, to no one. "Big ones," Josie agreed, appearing at his shoulder. Clara stayed at the table and watched her mother, and Ruth, feeling her daughter's eyes, turned and met them, and Clara's expression said everything she wouldn't say aloud. "Is this real? Is this ours? Is this finally ours?" And Ruth gave her the smallest nod she could manage, barely a movement of her chin, meaning, "I don't know yet, but I'm trying." Clara looked down at her hands. She nodded back. The room above the feed store was exactly what Dorothy had said. Small, cold, one narrow bed and one cot pushed against the opposite wall. Ruth put Henry and Josie on the cot with their coats piled on top. Clara took the floor with a folded blanket she insisted was comfortable. Ruth lay on the narrow bed with her coat across her feet and listened to her children breathe. When their breathing slowed and deepened, she got up. She sat at the single window. She looked out at Silver Creek under fresh snow, the empty street, the orange lamplight in a few windows, the mountains massive and white to the west. She pulled the document pouch from her bag. She didn't open it. She just held it. The children's birth records, her teaching certificates, the Helena superintendent's letter. The things that proved she was who she said she was, that they were hers, that she had a right to them, that no courthouse and no dead man's brother could simply revoke. "Mama!" Clara's voice from the darkness of the room, not sleepy. Clara never sounded sleepy when she was worried. "Still here," Ruth said. "Are you scared?" Ruth looked at the document pouch in her hands. She thought about the Helena courtroom, about Arthur Calloway's voice, calm, measured, not unkind, which was the worst of it. A woman traveling alone is not a stable environment for 3 children. The Calloway family can provide what she cannot. As if she were a weather condition, as if her children were property to be transferred to more capable hands. "Yes," Ruth said. "Of what?" "Of wanting this." She set the pouch down on the windowsill. "For a long time, I was scared of the wrong things, of your father's moods, of saying the wrong thing, of what people would think." She paused. "This scared is different. This is, I want this town to work. I want Monday to go well. I want you 3 to be safe here." She turned from the window. Wanting things is its own kind of terrifying, because they can be taken. Clara was quiet. Then, "Like before." Ruth did not answer that directly. "Get some sleep," she said. "School Monday. I want my children to make a good impression." "Josie's going to ask the teacher 100 questions." "Josie is interested in the world. That's not a flaw." "She asked Mr. Harmon today why his beard was that color and not a different color." "What did he say?" "He said he didn't rightly know." A pause. "He smiled when he said it." Ruth turned back to the window. Outside, the snow was still coming down, fine and steady, covering everything in white, covering tracks, covering roads. covering the distance between Silver Creek and Helena that she had driven in 4 days of cold and fear and 3 children who trusted her to know what she was doing. "Clara," she said. "Yes, Mama?" "You've been holding Henry's hand every time we go anywhere since we left Helena." "He doesn't like crowds." "I know. I'm not criticizing." Ruth paused. "I'm saying, I see you. I see what you do for your brother and your sister. And I see what it costs you." She heard Clara shift on her blanket. "You're 12 years old. You're allowed to need things too." The silence went long enough that Ruth thought her daughter had decided not to answer. Then Clara said, very quietly, "I need us to stay here." Ruth pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. "I know," she said. "Me too." She did not sleep much. She lay in the darkness and thought about Arthur Calloway, not with fear now, but with the cold, clear-eyed calculation she'd spent 8 months developing. He was a methodical man. He would inquire. He would hire someone to inquire. He would follow the chain of decisions she'd made. North, then west, then north again. Schoolteacher positions, advertisements in territorial newspapers. And he would arrive at Silver Creek eventually, with his reasonable face and his legal documents and his absolute conviction that he was doing right by his brother's children. He had 2 things in his favor, the law and money. She had one thing in hers. She was here first. She intended to use it. On Friday, she was sweeping the schoolhouse, because it needed it and because keeping her hands busy kept the fear manageable, when boots sounded on the threshold. Will Hargrove, hat already in his hand. "Miss Marsh sent me about the stovepipe," he said. "It's been drawn bad since October." "Cracked collar at the elbow joint," Ruth said, "and the firebox door needs attention before it gets colder." He looked at her. Then he crossed to the stove without asking her to point it out again, and crouched down and looked at the elbow joint. He nodded. "Got a collar at the ranch that'll fit," he said. "Monday morning, before school starts." "Thank you." He started to go. Stopped. He was looking at the blackboard, where she'd been practicing her right-hand script. Rows of careful, deliberate letters. "You practice often?" he asked. "Every day for 3 years," she said. "Right hand's not your natural one." It wasn't a question. She didn't treat it like one. "No," she said. "Left hand is." "Why train the right?" She looked at him. He was watching her with that same quality she'd noticed in the store. Not intrusive, not calculating, just present. Like a man who asked questions because he actually wanted to know the answers, not because he wanted to use them. "A teacher writes on a board," she said, "that children on both sides of the room need to read. Right hand reaches further without blocking the text." She paused. "And I wanted to be better than I was." He absorbed this. His eyes moved to the window briefly, then back to her. "Henry came by the stable yesterday," he said. "My man Lester let him brush one of the mares." Ruth went still. "He didn't tell me that." "Figured you might have said no." Something moved in Hargrove's face. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "Kid's got good hands. Lester said he talked to that horse the whole time, real quiet, like he knew her. Some people are born knowing how to be with animals." He settled his hat on. "Just thought you should know where he went." He left. The door swung shut. Ruth stood holding her broom and thought about Henry talking quietly to a horse. Henry, who barely talked to people, who pressed himself into corners in new rooms, who'd gone silent as a stone for 6 weeks after they left Helena, and only started speaking again somewhere past Bozeman, tentatively, testing the air. And something in her chest shifted. Not the careful, controlled warmth she rationed out to keep herself functional. Something rawer than that. something that had to do with her son finding a language he could use in a place that might, possibly, let him use it. She stood there longer than she meant to. She did not know yet, could not have known, that 90 miles south, on the road from Helena, a man in a dark wool coat was riding with 2 other men and a legal document, and the absolute patience of someone who considered this matter already concluded. She did not know that he had contacts in 4 territorial cities, that one of those contacts had seen her advertisement response in the Silver Creek Weekly Notice, that Arthur Calloway had read the name Ruth Calloway next to the words Silver Creek Schoolteacher, and had set down his coffee cup and reached for his hat, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once been told no by anything larger than weather. She didn't know he was coming. She didn't know how close he was. She didn't know that in 4 days she would be standing in Harmon's General Store with his hand flat on the wall beside her face, and his voice quiet in her ear, and her children's laughter audible through the wall behind her, and that the only thing standing between that moment and the thing that came after it would be a man she'd spoken to twice, who fixed stovepipes and let her son brush horses and asked questions because he actually wanted to know the answers. She swept the schoolhouse floor. She thought about lesson plans. She thought about 14 students and a warped blackboard and a firebox door that needed fixing before the weather got worse. Outside, the snow came down on Silver Creek, white and relentless, covering everything beneath it. The roads, the tracks, the distance she'd put between herself and Helena. And something was moving through it, steady and patient, that the snow could not cover. Arthur Calloway arrived on a Saturday morning, which Ruth would later think was deliberate. Saturday meant no school, which meant she had nowhere to be, no students waiting, no professional obligation that might make a scene inconvenient for him. He had always been a man who chose his moments carefully. She was at the Mercantile buying lamp oil when she heard the stage come in. She didn't look up immediately. Stages came through Silver Creek twice a week, and it was not her business who was on them. She was counting coins on the counter, working out whether she could afford both the lamp oil and a second blanket for the children, when Ed Harmon's eyes moved past her to the window, and something in his expression changed. Not alarm, not quite, but the particular alertness of a man who has seen trouble arrive on a stage before. Ruth turned around. Arthur Calloway stepped down from the stage onto the frozen street, like a man stepping into a room he already owned. He was 52 years old, broad through the shoulders, with gray at his temples, and a face that the world had always treated kindly, because he was the kind of man the world treated kindly. Prosperous, certain, wearing a wool coat that cost more than Ruth made in a month. He looked at the street. He looked at the storefronts. He looked at the sign above Harmon's General Store. Then he looked directly at the window where Ruth was standing. Their eyes met through the glass. Ruth set her coins back in her purse. She picked up the lamp oil. She paid Ed Harmon without looking at him and walked out the front door and down the porch steps and stopped on the frozen street, 3 feet from her dead husband's brother. "Ruth," Arthur said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, reasonable, measured. The voice of a man explaining something obvious to someone who should already understand it. "Arthur," she said, "you're looking well." He glanced up at the storefront, at the street, at Silver Creek in general, with the expression of a man doing quick calculations about real estate values. "Smaller than I expected." "What do you want?" He looked at her with something that might have been patience, if it weren't so clearly a performance of patience. "I think you know what I want, Ruth. I've come for the children." "The children are mine." "Legally, that's still a matter under consideration." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "The Territorial Court in Helena has scheduled a formal hearing for January 14th. You were supposed to receive this notice at your last known address, but you'd already left. He held it out. Consider yourself served. Ruth did not take the envelope. She stood with her lamp oil in one hand and looked at this man who had stood across a judge's desk and called her inadequate, with the same tone he used to order dinner. And she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not fear, not the cold dread that had driven her out of Helena at 4 a.m. with 3 sleeping children and $17. What she felt was anger, clean and clear and surprisingly steadying. "You drove 200 miles in December," she said, "to hand me a piece of paper." "I drove 200 miles," Arthur said, "because I want you to understand that I'm serious, that this isn't going away, that the most sensible thing you can do for those children is come back to Helena willingly and let the court settle this without a fight that will cost you whatever small amount of money you have left." The court gave you 30 days to contest. You left in 2. He tucked the envelope into his coat again when she still didn't reach for it. "That doesn't look good, Ruth." A judge looks at a woman who runs instead of fighting, and he asks himself why. What is she afraid of? What is she hiding? What kind of stability can she provide for 3 children when her first response to difficulty is to disappear? Ruth said nothing. She was counting, the way she counted her children every morning. Not her children now, but her words, the ones she was not going to say, the ones that would give him something to work with. "They are my children," she said finally. "I carry them. I raised them. I was their parent every day of their lives while your brother was—" She stopped. "They're mine. George provided for them. George provided for himself. The children were incidental." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. And quieter was worse, because quiet sounded like control she didn't have. "You didn't know your brother the way you think you did, Arthur." His expression didn't change. That was the thing about Arthur Calloway. His expression almost never changed, which made it impossible to tell whether you were reaching him or whether you were simply providing him information he'd file away to use against you later. "I knew him well enough," Arthur said. "And I know those children deserve better than a school teacher's salary in a Montana mountain town. Clara's 12. She should be in a proper school, not teaching herself from borrowed books. Josie needs stability. And Henry," he paused. "Henry needs a man in the house, Ruth. A boy that age needs—" "Don't." The word came out before she could stop it. "Don't you tell me what my son needs." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'm staying at the boarding house on the north end of town. I'll be here through Monday. If you want to discuss this civilly, I'm available." He touched the brim of his hat, the gesture so similar to Will Hargrove's that Ruth felt it like a physical insult. The courtesy of it, the performance of decency. "Think about the children, Ruth. That's all I'm asking." He walked away. Ruth stood on the frozen street and held her lamp oil and watched him go, and did not move until he'd turned the corner. Then she went to find Dorothy Marsh. Dorothy was in her dress shop, pinning a hem on a wool skirt with the focused attention she gave to everything. She looked up when Ruth came in, took one look at her face, and set down the pins. "Sit," Dorothy said. "I'm fine. You're white as the street outside. Sit down." Ruth sat. She put the lamp oil on the floor beside her feet and pressed her hands flat on her knees and told Dorothy Marsh everything. Not the version she'd been rationing out in careful pieces, but the whole of it. George Calloway and the 7 years of a marriage that looked correct from the outside and felt like drowning from the inside. The way he'd controlled every dollar, every conversation, every decision, with a pleasantness that made her feel insane for finding it suffocating. The way he'd never once raised his hand. He hadn't needed to. He had the law in his hand instead. Had told her once, quietly, over dinner, that if she ever tried to leave, He would have her declared unfit, and she would never see her children again. The way she'd believed him, because he was a judge, and he knew exactly what that threat was worth. And then he had died. A riding accident. His horse spooked on an icy road in April, and Ruth had sat in the funeral parlor and waited to feel something, and felt nothing but a terrible, expansive relief that she had spent 8 months being ashamed of. And then Arthur had come. Reasonable, measured, concerned. The Calloway family could provide. A woman traveling alone. Stability. January 14th. Dorothy listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ruth finished, the shop was very quiet. "The court date," Dorothy said. "January 14th. That's 5 weeks." "Yes." "You have your teaching credentials?" "Yes." "References?" "Yes." "You've been here less than a week, and you've already got 14 students and 2 parents who've told me their children came home talking about what they learned." Dorothy folded her hands in her lap. "That's something." "It's not enough," Ruth said. "Arthur has money. He has Helena connections. He has a story about a widowed woman who ran from a courtroom, which looks exactly as bad as he'll make it sound." She looked at her hands. "And he's not wrong that a school teacher's salary isn't— I can't give them what he's offering. I know that. I can't give them the house in Helena, and the school with proper books, and the—" Her voice caught, and she stopped it. "I can give them their mother. I don't know if that's enough for a judge." Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. "It should be," she said. "Should be isn't is." "No," Dorothy agreed. "It isn't." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. And when Dorothy Marsh thought it looked like a general planning a campaign. "I want you to talk to Will Hargrove." Ruth looked up. "Why?" "Because Will was a justice of the peace in Kansas for 6 years before he came here. He knows territorial law better than anyone in Silver Creek. And because he has a way of thinking about problems that cuts straight to the bone." Dorothy stood, picking up her pins. "He'll be at the council meeting Thursday. But if I were you, I wouldn't wait until Thursday." Ruth picked up her lamp oil and stood. "I don't want to ask him for help." "I know you don't. I've been asking for help since Helena, and I'm tired of what it costs." Dorothy looked at her with the expression of a woman who had also been tired, for a long time, of what things cost. "Asking for help from the right people," she said carefully, "isn't the same thing as owing something to the wrong ones. Will Hargrove won't make you pay for it." She paused. "He's not that kind of man." Ruth nodded once. She went to the door, then she stopped. "Dorothy," she said, "when you decided to let me stay, when you gave me the 2 weeks, was that—" She tried to find the words. "Did you know that something like this might follow me here?" Dorothy Marsh looked at her steadily. "I knew something had," she said. "It always does, with people who need a place this badly. The question I ask myself isn't what's following them. It's whether they're worth the trouble of standing beside when it arrives." She picked up the hem she'd been pinning. "You are," she said simply, and went back to work. Ruth found Will Hargrove at his stable, which was where, she was coming to understand, he could generally be found when he wasn't somewhere more specific. He was working on a piece of harness with a awl and heavy thread, sitting on an overturned crate in the wide central aisle, with 3 horses looking at him from their stalls, with the comfortable attention of animals in the presence of someone familiar. Henry was there too. Ruth stopped in the doorway and saw her son sitting on the ground beside the nearest stall, talking quietly to a gray mare who had her nose stretched toward him over the gate. Ruth had not known he was here. She told Clara and Josie to stay in the room above Briggs's and had told them to keep Henry with them. And here was Henry, in a stable 3 streets away, talking to a horse. She should have been angry. She found she couldn't quite get there. Hargrove looked up when she came in. He saw her face the way he seemed to see most things, quickly, thoroughly, without making a production of it. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Hargrove." She looked at Henry. "Henry James Calloway." Henry looked up at her. He had straw on his coat and his cheeks were flushed from the cold, and his eyes had the particular open quality they got around the gray mare. The same quality they used to get, years ago, around the cat they'd had in Helena before George decided cats were an unnecessary expense. "She knows me now," Henry said. "Lester says she didn't used to let strangers near, but she knows me now." "I see that." Ruth crouched beside him and brushed straw from his coat, and did not say what she was thinking, which was that her 5-year-old son had charmed a difficult horse in 3 days in a new town, which was more than she'd managed to do with most of the adults she'd met in a week, and that this was either a gift or a sign of something she needed to pay attention to. "You were supposed to stay with Clara." "Clara knows where I am. She's not worried." "I'm the one who decides if we're worried." Henry considered this with the philosophical patience he applied to most adult statements he found questionable. "The mare was worried," he said. "I came to check on her." Hargrove made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and Ruth looked up at him, and found him looking back at her with that quality she'd first noticed in the store. Not warm, not cold, just present, like a man who paid attention because he'd found it mattered. "He came by this morning," Hargrove said. "Lester told him to ask you first. He said he did." Ruth looked at Henry. "Did you ask me?" Henry looked at the mare. "You were at the mercantile." "That's not asking." "I asked Lester." Ruth straightened up. She looked at Will Hargrove. "Dorothy Marsh says you know territorial law," she said. He set down the harness. "Some of it." "Arthur Calloway is at the boarding house on North Street. He has a court date scheduled in Helena for January 14th. He's claiming I'm an unstable environment for my children, and the Calloway family can provide better." She said it the way she'd learned to say hard things. Flat, plain, without apology or performance. "I need to know what I'm working with." He was quiet for a moment. "You ran before the 30-day contest period." "I left in 2 days, yes." "That's what he'll use most. Flight implies guilt in a courtroom. It doesn't matter what you were actually afraid of. The fact that you left, instead of staying to fight, gives him a narrative." He picked up the harness again, turned it in his hands without working on it. "What's your employment status with the school currently?" 2-week trial. Dorothy's decision." "References?" "Helena superintendent and 2 others." "The children's ages?" "Clara 12, Josie 8, Henry 5. "Any of them want to go with him?" The question was direct enough that Ruth blinked. "No," she said. "Absolutely not." "That matters. At those ages, a judge will ask them. Not always. But with a case like this, a decent judge will want to hear from the oldest, at least." He set the harness down again. "Clara, she's steady?" Ruth thought of her daughter standing straight beside the wagon wheel in a strange town, holding Henry's hand without being asked. "Yes," she said. "She's the steadiest person I know." He nodded. He was looking at Henry, who had gone back to his quiet conversation with the mare. His expression had something in it that Ruth couldn't immediately name. Not pity, not sentiment, but something older and more personal than either. "My wife grew up without her mother," he said. He said it the way people say things they don't say often, carefully, testing the weight of the words as they left. "Her father was a good man. He did his best. But there are things—" He stopped. "There are things a mother knows about her children that don't transfer, that can't be handed off to a more prosperous household." He looked at Ruth. "I'll come to the council meeting Thursday, and I'll tell them what I know about territorial custody law. And if it comes to needing a character witness before January 14th, I'll provide one." Ruth looked at him. "Why?" He met her eyes.
"Because you drove 230 miles through 2 blizzards in December with 3 children and $17.
He stopped. "Dorothy told me," he said, without apology. "And because the Calloway family can't give your son what that mare just gave him. Some things aren't about what's more prosperous." He stood, picking up the harness. "That's why." Ruth stood in the stable doorway with straw on her boots and the cold at her back, and looked at this man, this complicated, careful, quietly angry man, and felt something she didn't have a name for settle into the space between her ribs, like a coal set gently down. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. Henry stood up from beside the mare's stall and came to take Ruth's hand, and she took it, and they walked back through Silver Creek together in the thin winter light. And Ruth thought about Dorothy's words, and Hargrove's, and the court date 6 weeks away. And she thought about Arthur Calloway sitting in the boarding house on North Street, right now, perfectly comfortable, perfectly patient, with all his legal certainty arranged around him like a warm coat. She thought about what it meant that for the first time in 8 months, she was not planning to run. She was planning to stay, to fight, on ground she had chosen. She was still thinking about it when they got back to the room above Briggs's, and Clara opened the door before they reached the top of the stairs. She had been listening for their footsteps, Ruth realized, the way she always listened, always alert, always the first line of whatever defense was required, and looked at Henry, then at her mother's face, and said, "He came to town, didn't he?" Ruth stepped inside. She set down the lamp oil. She looked at all 3 of her children, Clara in the doorway, Josie on the cot with a book open across her knees, Henry still holding Ruth's hand. 3 children who had packed what they could carry and climbed into a wagon in the dark and trusted her with a ferocity she was only beginning to understand she had earned. "Yes," she said. "He came." "What are we going to do?" Clara asked. Ruth took off her coat. She hung it on the peg behind the door. She turned to face her oldest daughter, this 12-year-old who had been steadying the world for everyone around her since she was old enough to understand that someone had to. "We're going to stay," Ruth said. "And we're going to fight. And we're going to win." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, that small, precise nod that meant she'd made a decision. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what to do." Clara's question hung in the room for a moment, and Ruth looked at her daughter, this child who had learned too young that waiting for someone else to handle things was a luxury unavailable to them, and felt the full weight of what she was asking her to carry. "Right now," Ruth said, "you do nothing. You go to school Monday. You are kind to the other children. You let people see who you are." She moved to the cot and sat down beside Josie, who had closed her book and was watching with the focused attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to memorize. "All 3 of you. That's the job right now. Just be yourselves." "That's it?" Josie said. "That's everything," Ruth said. Josie considered this with visible skepticism. "Mr. Calloway seems like the kind of man who needs more than us being ourselves to change his mind." "He's not the one who needs to change his mind," Ruth said. "A judge is." "Oh." Josie absorbed this. "Then we have to impress the judge." "We have to be honest in front of the judge, which means being who you are, not performing who you think you should be. A judge who knows his business can tell the difference." Ruth smoothed Josie's braid, the one that was always coming undone. "Can you do that?" "I can talk to a judge," Josie said, with the confidence of a child who had never met a judge and therefore felt no particular intimidation. "I talk to everybody." "I know you do." Ruth kissed the top of her head. That's one of your better qualities. That night, after the children slept, Ruth sat with the lamp turned low and wrote out everything she remembered about George Calloway's behavior over 7 years of marriage. Not for a court filing, not yet, but because Dorothy had told her once that the most dangerous thing a woman could do in a legal fight was rely on her memory in the moment. Write it down now, while it was still clear. Write it all. She wrote for 2 hours. Her hand cramped. She kept writing. Monday came the way Monday always did, too fast and before she was ready, which was the nature of things that mattered. Ruth walked her children to the schoolhouse door at 7:30, kissed Henry on the top of his head over his protests, watched Clara take his hand and lead him inside, and then stood alone on the schoolhouse porch for 30 seconds, doing nothing but breathing. Then she went inside and taught. The 14 students of Silver Creek ranged, as Dorothy had warned, from a gap-toothed boy of 6 named Samuel, who could barely hold a pencil, to a 15-year-old girl named Nora Finch, who sat in the back row with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who had decided several months ago that this particular room had nothing to offer her. Ruth had seen that expression before. She knew exactly what it meant and exactly what to do with it, which was to ignore it entirely until the moment presented itself. She wrote on the board. She called on students by name. She had learned all 14 names from Dorothy on Sunday, along with brief biographical notes on each family. She moved through arithmetic and reading with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned that children followed a confident adult the way water followed a slope, not because they were told to, but because it was simply the direction of least resistance. At mid-morning, she gave the older students a written problem set and crouched beside Samuel, the 6-year-old, and showed him again how to hold the pencil. "Like this," she said. "Not like you're wrestling it." Samuel giggled. The girl next to him, who was 7 and already managing reasonable letter formation, leaned over to look at his work with the proprietary concern of a child who has recently mastered something and wishes others to catch up. From the back row, Ruth was aware of Nora Finch watching. Not at her work, at Ruth. At noon, when the other students scattered for lunch, Nora stayed in her seat. Ruth was erasing the morning's arithmetic from the board when she heard the girl's voice behind her. "You write with your right hand," Nora said. "But you just erased that with your left." Ruth set down the eraser. She turned around. Nora Finch was 16, sharp-featured, with dark eyes that missed nothing, and a set to her jaw that said she had not had an easy time of things, and had decided to be angry about it, rather than diminished. Ruth recognized the posture. She had worn it herself for years. "I do," Ruth said. "Which one's natural?" "Left." Nora absorbed this. "Why train the other one?" Ruth looked at this girl, who asked questions like a woman who had been told her questions were inconvenient, and had asked them anyway. "Because I wanted to be able to do something I couldn't do naturally," she said. "And because sometimes the thing you have to teach yourself is more yours than the thing that came easy." Nora looked at her for a long moment. "My father says girls don't need more than basic reading and figuring. What do you say?" The question seemed to catch Nora off guard. Not the content of it, but the directness. The fact that it was a genuine question rather than a rhetorical one. She looked down at her desk. "I say I want to know things," she said, quieter. "I don't see why wanting to know things has anything to do with being a girl." "It doesn't," Ruth said. "Come back after school. I'll give you something harder than what the others are doing." Nora looked up. Something moved in her expression. Cautious. Not quite hope. The preliminary stage before hope, when a person is still deciding whether it's safe to want something. "Why?" she said. "Because you're bored," Ruth said. "And bored smart people either cause trouble
or find something worth doing. I'd rather you do the second. She picked up the eraser again. After school, bring your slate. Nora said nothing, but she came back after school. The Thursday council meeting happened in the back room of Harmon's General Store, which smelled of pipe tobacco and cold wood, and the particular staleness of a space where difficult decisions had been made for years. Dorothy sat at the head of the table, Ed Harmon to her left. Reverend Cole, a man of 65, with a quiet face of someone who had stopped judging people sometime in his 5th decade and found the resulting peace considerable, sat at the far end. Will Hargrove came in last, hat in hand, and took the remaining chair. Arthur Calloway had not been invited. He came anyway. He knocked twice on the back room door and walked in before anyone answered, which told Ruth everything she needed to know about how he viewed the consent of others. He stood in the doorway in his expensive coat and looked at the assembled council with the pleasant expression of a man attending a meeting he considered himself already in charge of. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, in a tone that did not apologize for anything. "I thought it might be useful for the council to hear directly from the Calloway family, given that the situation involves 3 of your community's newer members." Dorothy looked at him the way a mountain looks at weather. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "this is a closed council meeting." "I understand. I won't take much of your time." He moved into the room without being invited and stood with his hands behind his back, the posture of a man accustomed to speaking to groups. "I want to be transparent with you. My concern is simple. My brother's children deserve stability. Mrs. Calloway is a capable woman. I don't dispute that. But a capable woman working a school teacher's salary in a frontier town is not the same thing as a family that can provide for those children's futures. Clara is 12. Her education, Ruth said, is being handled." Arthur looked at her with the patience he would have given a child who had interrupted. "I'm sure it is, for now. But what happens next year? When Clara needs more than a one-room schoolhouse? When Henry needs—" "Stop using my children's names," Ruth said. "You don't know them. You've met them twice." "I knew their father." "Then you know about as much as you think you do." The room went quiet. Arthur looked at her with something that might have been surprise, not at what she'd said, but at the fact that she'd said it in front of witnesses, without flinching. Dorothy Marsh cleared her throat. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I'm going to ask you to wait in the store while we conduct our meeting. If the council has questions for you, we'll let you know." Arthur looked at Dorothy. He looked at Hargrove, who had not said a word and had not moved, and was watching Arthur with the particular stillness of a man deciding something. He looked at Ruth. "Of course," he said. He turned and left. The door closed. Will Hargrove put both hands on the table. "He'll file for an emergency custody order if he thinks the council is backing Ruth," he said. "He'll argue that the community is enabling flight behavior. That's his next move." "Can he do that?" Ed Harmon asked. "He can try. The question is whether a territorial judge grants it, and that depends on what Ruth can demonstrate before January 14th. Will looked at her directly. "How long have you been teaching?" 6 years total. "Any documented complaints or disciplinary actions against you?" "No." "The children, have they expressed any preference to any adult in Silver Creek about where they want to live?" Ruth thought. "Clara told Dorothy they wanted to stay." Dorothy nodded. She did, unprompted. "Get that in writing," Will said. "A statement from Dorothy as a council member carrying more weight than from a neighbor." He turned his hat in his hands. "And I'll tell you what else. Arthur Calloway is not going to leave Silver Creek on his own schedule. He's going to stay and watch. He's going to talk to parents. He's going to create doubt about you because doubt is his primary tool. He doesn't have evidence of wrongdoing, so he needs to manufacture an atmosphere of uncertainty.
He looked at Ruth. You need to be beyond reproach for the next 5 weeks. Every decision you make, every word you say in public, everything visible.
I'm aware, Ruth said.
I know you are. I'm saying it out loud so everyone in this room is clear. He looked around the table. And I'm saying that what Ruth needs from this council right now is public, visible support, not behind the scenes. Arthur Calloway has to see that Silver Creek is behind her, because if he thinks she's isolated, he'll press harder. If he thinks she has the community, he'll start calculating the cost of a long fight. You think he'll back down? Ed Harmon asked. I think he's a man used to winning by making things expensive and exhausting, Will said. Men like that tend to recalculate when the other side doesn't exhaust. He paused. He expected her to be alone. She's not alone. Dorothy looked at Ruth. Well, she said, you heard him. Ruth's throat was doing something inconvenient. She pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed through it. I don't want to be a burden to this town, she said. I came here to work, to contribute, not to drag people into my... Mrs. Calloway, Reverend Cole spoke for the first time, his voice unhurried and mild. I have been in this town for 9 years. In that time, I have watched Silver Creek take in 17 families who came here with nothing but need and determination. Every single one of them said the same thing you just said. He folded his hands. Every single one of them contributed something this town needed that we didn't know we were missing until they arrived. Your children have been here 1 week. Henry Calloway already knows every horse in Hargrove's stable by name. Josie asked me 4 questions after Sunday service that I had to actually think about before I answered. Clara held the door for 3 different people on her way into school this morning without anyone asking her to. He looked at Ruth steadily. That's not burden. That's community. Ruth looked down at the table. Then she looked up. Thank you, she said. She said it simply, without qualification, because Dorothy had told her that refusing kindness was its own kind of pride, and she was trying to be done with pride that cost her things she needed. She was walking home from the meeting when she heard Arthur Calloway's voice behind her. Ruth! She stopped. She turned around. He was standing 10 feet back on the frozen boardwalk, alone, his breath making small clouds in the December air. For the first time since he'd arrived, his expression had changed. Not softened, not apologized, but shifted into something that might have been something like honesty. That man, Arthur said. Hargrove. How long have you known him? A week, Ruth said. He spoke about you like... Arthur paused. Something worked in his jaw. He spoke about you like a man who intends to be involved in your situation. Mr. Hargrove believes in being direct, Ruth said. So do I. So let's be direct. You came here because you think you're doing right by George's children. I understand that. I believe you believe it. She took a step toward him. But Arthur, those are not George's children. They are my children. They have my eyes and my mother's stubbornness, and they have never in their lives had a single good night's sleep in that house in Helena, because children feel things, even when they can't name them. They felt every day of that marriage. Her voice stayed level by pure will. Whatever you think you're offering them, it smells like their father's house, and they know it. Arthur's face tightened. You're saying, George, I'm saying the children want to stay here, in a room above a feed store with 3 blankets and a lamp that goes out too fast. They want to stay here. She held his gaze. What does that tell you, Arthur? What does it tell a man who loves them, which I believe you do, that 3 children will choose cold and unfamiliar over warm and prosperous? He had no answer. She could see it. Not in a softening, Not in retreat, but in the almost imperceptible stillness that came over him. The pause of a man who had arrived at a question he hadn't prepared for. She left him standing there. She was almost back to Briggs's feed store when she heard quick boots behind her and turned to find Will Hargrove falling into step beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He walked with the same economy he brought to everything. No wasted movement, no unnecessary noise. "You talked to him," he said after a moment. Not a question. "He talked to me first." "What did you say?" Ruth thought about it. "I told him the truth," she said. "I don't know if it will do anything, but it seemed like it should be said." Will nodded. They walked in silence for half a block. Snow had started again, the fine, dry kind that the Montana wind sent sideways rather than down. "My wife," Will said, "she used to say that the truth had a weight to it, that even when people didn't respond to it right away, you could see them carrying it afterward." He paused. She was usually right. Ruth glanced at him. "How long ago did you lose her?" 6 years. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without dramatizing. "Fever. Quick." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. It changes things, losing someone. Makes you look at people differently. Makes you look at what's worth standing up for. He glanced at her. "I don't say that to make it about me. I say it because I want you to understand why I'm not just doing this because it's the right thing to do legally." He stopped walking. Ruth stopped too. "I'm doing it because your son talked to a horse for an hour and a half on a Tuesday, and when I came into the stable, he didn't even look up because he was so completely in the moment of it." Something moved in his face. Ellen would have loved that. She always said the measure of a child is where they put their full attention. He looked at Ruth. "Your children put their full attention on everything. That's you. That's what you gave them." Ruth stood on the frozen boardwalk in the sideways snow and felt something she'd spent 8 months carefully not feeling, because feeling it while she was running had been the kind of luxury she couldn't afford. She felt, for one undefended moment, seen. Not assessed or evaluated or found adequate or found lacking, but simply seen. The way a person wants to be seen and almost never is. She looked away first. She looked at Briggs's feed store, at the light in the window above it that meant Clara had the lamp on. "I should get back," she said. "Clara will have Henry and Josie in bed if I'm lucky, and Henry's had a theory all week about why he should get to stay up later on account of the horse." Something shifted in Hargrove's expression. "What's the theory?" "He says the horse is more awake at night, and someone should know that." She looked at him. "He has thoughts about it." Hargrove made that sound again, the one that wasn't quite a laugh, but came from the same place a laugh does. "Tell him I said he can come by Saturday morning," he said. "Lester'll be there. The mare gets a new shoe Saturday, and Henry can watch if he doesn't mind the noise." "He won't mind the noise," Ruth said. She climbed the stairs to the room above Briggs's and found exactly what she'd hoped. Henry asleep. Josie reading by lamplight, with the stubborn determination of a child intent on finishing one more chapter. And Clara, sitting at the table with Ruth's written notes spread in front of her, reading them in the careful way she read everything, like someone who intended to remember. Ruth stopped. "Clara." Clara looked up. She didn't look guilty. She looked like a 12-year-old who had made a calculation and stood by it. "You left them out," she said. "I wanted to know." Ruth sat down across from her. "Those are hard things to read." "I know." Clara's voice was steady. "I remember most of it anyway." Ruth looked at her daughter.
She thought about all the things she'd tried to protect Clara from seeing, and how completely, utterly unsuccessful she'd been. Because children saw everything, especially the things you were trying hardest to hide. "Does it help?" Ruth asked.
Reading it, Clara thought about this seriously. "It makes me less scared of the judge," she said, "because it's all real. It all happened. He can't say it didn't because you wrote it down."
"He might say it anyway."
"Then we say it louder."
Clara looked at her mother.
"Will Mr. Hargrove be there? At the hearing?"
"I believe so."
"Good."
Clara restacked the pages neatly and set them to the side.
"He's the kind of man who says things once and means them. Judges probably like that."
Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over her daughter's. Clara turned her palm up and held on, and they sat like that for a moment in the lamplight, while Josie turned a page and Henry slept, and the snow came down on Silver Creek, steady and quiet, covering everything beneath it. Arthur Calloway was still in town. January 14th was still coming. The judge was still a stranger who had never met any of them, and would have to be shown, in the space of a few hours, what Ruth Calloway already knew in her bones. That a family was not a house, or a salary, or a name that carried weight in Helena courtrooms. A family was this: 4 people in a room above a feed store, holding on. The weeks between the council meeting and January 14th moved the way dangerous things always moved. Deceptively slow in the middle, terrifyingly fast at the edges. Ruth taught school every day. She came early and stayed late. She gave Nora Finch harder problems every Tuesday and Thursday after school, and watched the girl's angry, hungry intelligence unfurl the way a fist opens when it finally decides to trust. She helped Samuel learn to hold his pencil without wrestling it. She read aloud to the younger children in the last half hour of every Friday, and by the second week, half the parents in Silver Creek were arriving 5 minutes early for pickup, just to stand in the doorway and listen. Arthur Calloway watched all of it. He had settled into the boarding house on North Street with the patient determination of a man on a schedule he trusted, and he appeared in town every day, at the Mercantile, at the saloon where the men gathered in the evenings, at the church on Sunday, where he sat 3 rows behind Ruth and her children, with his hands folded, and his expression thoughtful, and his presence impossible to ignore. He spoke to parents. He spoke to Ed Harmon. He spoke to everyone with that same reasonable, measured voice, never accusing, never threatening, simply raising questions in the careful way of a man who understood that doubt, once planted, grew on its own. Ruth knew what he was doing. She had watched George do a version of it for years. The gentle erosion, the slow accumulation of other people's uncertainty. The way a man with enough patience and the right tone could make a room full of people question something they'd been completely sure of 20 minutes before. She could not stop him from talking. She could only keep being exactly who she was, every day, in front of everyone who might eventually have to form an opinion. On a Wednesday in late December, 3 weeks before the hearing, Clara came home from school with a bruise on her cheekbone. Ruth was at the table correcting arithmetic papers when the door opened, and she looked up and saw it. A fresh bruise, high on Clara's right cheekbone, the kind that comes from another child's fist rather than a fall. Clara's expression was the carefully composed one she wore when she had already decided how she wanted to handle something and did not want her mother to change the plan. "Sit down," Ruth said.
"I'm fine, Mama."
"I know you are. Sit down anyway." Clara sat. Josie, who had been drawing at the other end of the table, looked at her sister's face and then at her mother, and had the unusual wisdom to say nothing. Henry was already asleep, worn out from a Saturday at the stable that had become a standing arrangement with Lester and the gray mare. Ruth put 2 fingers gently under Clara's chin and turned her face toward the lamp. The bruise was going to be significant by morning. There was a small cut at the edge of it, barely more than a scrape. "Who?" Ruth said. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." Clara met her eyes. "Peter Aldridge. He said—" She stopped, started again. "He said his father said that we were trouble, and that you'd bring problems to Silver Creek, and that we should have stayed wherever we came from." Her voice was level, completely level, the same tone she used to report facts in arithmetic. "I told him his father was wrong. He disagreed with his fist."
Ruth set down the wet cloth she'd been reaching for. "Did you hit him back?" Clara looked at the table. "Yes." "And?" He cried. A pause. "I didn't." Ruth looked at her daughter for a long moment. She thought about what she should say. The speech about violence. The one about restraint. The one about being better than the provocation. She thought about all of it and set it aside. "Does anything else hurt?" she said. "No." "Are you sure?" "Yes." Ruth nodded. She pressed the wet cloth gently to the bruise. Clara sat still and let her. "Mama," Clara said quietly, "is Mr. Calloway's talking working? Are people starting to—" "Some people will always side with the man in the expensive coat," Ruth said. "We can't control that. We can only control what we give them to look at on the other side." She worked carefully around the cut. "Peter Aldridge's father is one man. Ed Harmon gave Henry a peppermint on our first day here. Dorothy Marsh fed us when she didn't have to. Baron Cole knows every child in Silver Creek by name." She paused. "This town is not one voice, Clara. Never let one loud voice convince you it is." Clara was quiet. Then, "What if the judge listens to Mr. Calloway?" Ruth set down the cloth. She looked at her daughter directly. "Then we appeal," she said. "And we fight again. And we keep fighting until we run out of courts." She held Clara's gaze. "I will not stop. Do you understand me? I will not stop." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Something in the girl's face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the loosening of a tension she'd been holding so long she'd stopped noticing it. "Okay," Clara said. "Okay." The next morning, Ruth went to see Will Hargrove. She found him where she always found him, at the stable, this time working with a young horse who was not yet comfortable with the weight of a saddle. He was moving slowly around the animal, one hand always in contact with its side, talking in a low, continuous murmur that seemed less about words than about the sound of something steady and patient. He saw her come in and held up one finger. Wait. And finished what he was doing with the horse before he came to her. She had noticed this about him. He finished things. He didn't drop what he was in the middle of to appear responsive. He finished it, and then he came. "Clara got hit by a child yesterday," Ruth said. "Peter Aldridge. His father has apparently been talking." Will leaned against the stable wall. He didn't look surprised. "Robert Aldridge," he said. "He runs a small spread east of town. He and Arthur Calloway had dinner at the boarding house Saturday night." He paused. "I heard about it Sunday." "You didn't tell me." "I was deciding whether it was useful information or just upsetting information. Ended up being both." He looked at her. "How's Clara?" "She hit him back and didn't cry." Ruth crossed her arms. "She's fine. She stopped. She started again with more accuracy. "I need to know where we stand. Really stand. Not the optimistic version. The real one." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. He had the quality, she'd noticed, of taking questions seriously,
of not reaching for reassurance before he'd actually considered the answer. "Honestly," he said, "always." Arthur Calloway is organized, and he's patient, and he's been doing exactly what I expected him to do, which is build a narrative over time with the people in this town who are inclined to listen. He won't convert everyone, but he doesn't need everyone. He needs enough of a shadow of doubt that a judge looks at Silver Creek and sees contested ground, rather than clear community support. He met her eyes. What we have is stronger, but it's quieter. We need to make it louder before the 14th. How? Character statements. Written from people in Silver Creek who have had direct contact with you and the children. Specific observations, not general impressions. Dorothy can write about your classroom performance. Reverend Cole can write about the children's conduct and integration into the community. I'll write about the legal framework and why the original Helena ruling was based on incomplete information. He paused. And I think Clara should speak. Ruth went still. She's 12. I know. And she's the most composed 12-year-old I've met in my life. A judge who interviews her is going to hear a child who knows her own mind, who isn't performing, who has specific reasons for where she wants to be. He looked at her. Judges see coached children all the time, Ruth. They know the difference. Clara won't sound coached because she isn't. She'll sound like what she is. A child who has thought about this and decided. Ruth looked at her hands. She thought about Clara at the table with the lamp on, reading the notes Ruth had written about 7 years of marriage, saying, "It makes me less scared of the judge because it's all real." "I'll ask her," Ruth said. "It's her choice." "Of course," Hargrove said. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Ruth looked up at him. He was watching her with that quality she still didn't have a word for. The steady, undemanding attention of a man who is present without pressing. She had been around men who crowded, who filled every available space with their opinions and their certainty and their conviction that they knew better. Hargrove didn't crowd. He stood where he was and let her have the room she needed. And somehow, that made the room feel larger rather than emptier. "Why did you leave Kansas?" she asked. It wasn't the question she'd come to ask. It came out anyway. He looked mildly surprised. Then he looked at the young horse moving in the stall behind her, and his expression shifted into the careful honesty she'd come to recognize. "I made a ruling," he said. "A custody case. Mother against the father's family. The mother had done nothing wrong, nothing legally actionable. But she was poor, and she was alone, and the father's family had a lawyer, and she didn't. And I sat on that bench, and I looked at the law as written, and the law as written gave me no room to rule in her favor." He stopped. "So I ruled against her, because the law said I had to. And I watched her walk out of that courtroom without her children." He was quiet for a moment. "I resigned the next morning. Came out here and decided if I couldn't apply the law fairly, I'd rather fix stovepipes and shoes horses, and not pretend I was serving justice." Ruth looked at him. "And now?" "Now I think maybe I ran when I should have stayed and fought for better law." He glanced at her. "That tends to be the theme, doesn't it? Knowing when to run and when to stand still." "You told me once that sometimes peace has to be won," Ruth said. "I did. I think you were talking to yourself as much as to me." Something moved in his face. "Probably," he said. They stood in the stable, in the particular quiet of a cold morning, with horses breathing around them. And Ruth thought about a man who had left a courtroom because he couldn't bear what he'd had to do in it, and a woman who had left a house because she couldn't bear what she was becoming in it, and how two people who had run from different things had ended up in the same small Montana town in December. "Will," she said. "Yeah?" "After January 14th, whether we win or whether we don't, I want you to know that what you've done here has mattered." She said it plainly, the way he said things. "Not just legally. The way you've talked about my children, the things you've noticed." She paused. "It's mattered."
He looked at her for a moment. His jaw worked slightly. Then he said, "You planning to tell me that like it's a conclusion?"
"What do you mean?"
"I mean, it sounds like something a person says when they're tying up a loose end. Getting something said before a thing ends." He met her eyes. "I'm not a loose end, Ruth. And this isn't ending on January 14th, regardless of what the judge says." Ruth looked at him. The thing between her ribs that she'd been carefully not naming shifted again. Warmer this time, less careful.
"No," she said. "I suppose it isn't."
She walked back to the schoolhouse. She had students in 40 minutes. She had papers to arrange, and chalk to find, and a warped blackboard that she'd learned to use advantageously by writing on the less warped sections. She had a job, and children, and a court date, and a man in a boarding house who was methodically trying to dismantle everything she'd built. She also had something she hadn't had when she drove into Silver Creek 3 weeks ago. She had something that felt, cautiously and not without fear, like ground beneath her feet. The ground shifted 2 days before the hearing. She was locking the schoolhouse at 4 in the afternoon when she heard boots on the porch and turned to find Arthur Calloway standing there, alone. No documents in his hand this time. No rehearsed posture. He looked, for the first time since he'd arrived, like a man who had not slept well. "I need to speak with you," he said. "Not as opposing parties, just as 2 people who knew George." Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she unlocked the door and went back inside and left it open behind her. He came in. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands and looked at the children's work pinned on the walls. The arithmetic problems Ruth had marked with encouraging comments. The hand-drawn maps of Montana that Josie had made everyone do because she thought it was useful information. Samuel's carefully labored letters getting bigger and more confident week by week. Arthur looked at the maps for a long time. "George wrote to me," he said finally. "The last 2 years of the marriage. He wrote to me regularly." He turned his hat in his hands. "I've been reading those letters again since I came here, trying to, I don't know, understand something." His jaw tightened. "He wrote about you the way a man writes about something he owns, not someone he loves. I didn't see it when I was reading them then. I see it now." Ruth said nothing. She waited. "He wrote about Clara, how she was too much like you, how Josie was too loud, how Henry cried too easily." Arthur's voice was entirely flat. "I read those letters and I thought he was just venting. Every man vents about his family. I didn't—" He stopped. "I chose not to see it." "Yes," Ruth said, quietly, without heat. "I'm not here to apologize," Arthur said. "I don't think an apology covers it. I'm here because I looked at that wall and I saw Josie's name on that map, and she spelled Montana wrong, and you corrected it in red pencil and wrote, 'Almost, try again.' And she drew a star next to it." He looked at Ruth. "George would have—" He stopped again. "George would not have said, 'almost.' George would have made her feel stupid for the mistake." The schoolhouse was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through Silver Creek with the particular persistence of Montana December wind. "Why did you come here, Arthur?" Ruth said. Not harshly, genuinely. He took a breath. "Because George is dead and his children are alive. and I told myself I owed it to him, to make sure they were—" He pressed his lips together. "But George didn't love those children. I think I knew that. And I came here anyway because it was easier to be angry at you than to grieve the kind of man my brother actually was." Ruth sat down on the nearest bench. She was not going to feel sorry for Arthur Calloway, exactly, but she was going to let him be a person for a moment, rather than an obstacle. "He had good in him," she said. "Early on. Or I thought he did. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I saw what I wanted to see because I wanted someone to take care of us." She looked at her hands. "I wasn't entirely a victim, Arthur. I made choices. Some of them were desperate choices, but they were mine." Arthur looked at her. "You're being generous to me that I don't deserve." "I'm being honest. There's a difference." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not going to withdraw the petition." Ruth had not expected him to. "I know, but I'm going to speak honestly to the judge about what I've seen here, about—" He looked at the wall again, at Josie's map with the red pencil correction and the star. "About what I've been able to observe in 3 weeks, which is that those children are exactly where they should be." He met her eyes. "I should have seen that from the start." Ruth looked at him. She felt something complicated move through her. Not forgiveness, not yet. Not the clean, finished kind. Something more like the recognition that grief made people do things, and that a man who could read his brother's letters again after 30 years and finally see them clearly was not entirely without the capacity for honesty. "Arthur," she said. "Yes?" "Come to the school Friday morning. Watch a lesson. Not as opposition, just as—" She paused. "Come watch your brother's children learn something." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face that she didn't try to name. "All right," he said. He came on Friday. He sat in the back, by the door, with his hat on his knees, and he watched Ruth teach 14 children arithmetic and geography, and the difference between a fact and an opinion. He watched Josie argue passionately with a boy twice her size about the correct spelling of a river name, and win by producing the almanac from under her seat where she kept it. He watched Clara help a younger student sound out a difficult word with a patience that looked so much like Ruth that it stopped Arthur mid-breath. He watched Henry sit in the front row, perfectly still for 20 minutes of reading aloud, absolutely rapt, and then raise his hand with a question about horses that was technically off-topic, but demonstrated that he'd been listening to every word. At noon, when the children scattered, Arthur Calloway stood up from his chair in the back and walked to where Ruth was erasing the board. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "George never once mentioned that Josie was funny." Ruth turned around. "She's very funny," she said. "I can see that." His voice was rough in a way it hadn't been before. "She's her own person. All 3 of them are their own people." He turned his hat in his hands. He never saw that. He never would have. Ruth waited. "I'll tell the judge what I've seen," Arthur said. "Truthfully. All of it. What I observed in Helena and what I've observed here." He looked at her. "I can't promise you what he'll decide, but I won't stand in that courtroom and argue something I no longer believe." After he left, Ruth stood alone in the schoolhouse and held herself very still for a moment. She didn't cry. She was past the point of the kind of crying that came from being overwhelmed. But she stood there and breathed, and let the thing that had just happened settle into her bones. Then she put on her coat and walked to the stable, because she needed to tell someone, and she was finding, carefully and not without intention, that the person she most wanted to tell things to was standing in a stable 3 streets north of the schoolhouse, probably talking to a horse. She walked in, and Will Hargrove looked up from the harness he was working on, and saw her face, and set the harness down immediately. "What happened?" he said.
"Something good," Ruth said. "I think. Something I didn't expect." She told him. He listened without interrupting, his dark eyes on her face, his hands still in his lap. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You asked him to come watch the children." "Yes." "Knowing he might use what he saw against you." "Yes." He looked at her. "That's either very brave or very—" "Stupid?" Ruth offered. "I was going to say trusting," he paused. "Which I've decided is the same as brave, actually. For someone who's had as many good reasons as you to stop trusting." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Ruth." "Yes?" "Whatever happens on the 14th, I want you to know something." He looked at her steadily. "I've been in Silver Creek for 6 years. I have been, for most of those 6 years, a man going through motions, working, eating, sleeping, present in the physical sense, and not much more." He paused. "You and those 3 children have been here 4 weeks, and I have not once in 4 weeks simply gone through a motion." He held her gaze. "I don't know what to do with that entirely, but I know it's true. And you deserve to know it's true before we walk into a courtroom together." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. The stable was warm around them, the horses quiet, the wind pressing at the walls outside. She thought about the woman who had driven into Silver Creek 4 weeks ago, counting her children like things most likely to be taken. She thought about what it meant as she was sitting here now, in a stable that smelled of hay and cold leather, feeling, for the first time in years, like someone who was not simply surviving. "Ask me again," she said quietly. "After the 14th. Ask me whatever you're thinking about asking me. After." He nodded once. The same small nod that meant he'd heard her, he understood, and he would wait as long as the waiting needed. "After," he said. Outside, the snow was falling again on Silver Creek. 3 days until January 14th. 3 days until a judge in Helena would look at Ruth Calloway and her 3 children and everything she had built in 4 weeks and decide whether it was enough. She intended to walk into that courtroom ready. She intended to walk in with everything she had, every letter, every statement, every arithmetic paper with a red pencil correction and a star beside it, every memory of 7 years she had written out by lamplight with a cramping hand. She was not going to run. She was going to stand still. And she was not going to do it alone. The morning of January 14th arrived the way Ruth had known it would. Quietly, without ceremony, the Montana sky pale gray above Silver Creek, and the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made breathing feel like a deliberate act. She was awake before dawn. She had not slept much, but the sleeplessness had not been the fearful kind. Not the vigilant, listening for danger sleeplessness she'd known for 7 years in Helena. It had been the sleeplessness of someone who had prepared everything they could prepare and was now simply waiting for the moment to begin. She dressed carefully. Her best dress, dark blue wool, the one she'd brought from Helena, because it was the most professional thing she owned. She pinned her hair with more precision than usual. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand for a moment. This woman who had driven 200 miles through blizzards, who had stood in front of 14 children every morning and taught them things worth knowing, who had looked Arthur Calloway in the eye in this town's streets and told him truths he hadn't been ready to hear. She looked like someone who intended to win. She woke the children at 6. Clara was already sitting up in bed, dressed to the waist, waiting. Josie complained about the hour with her usual thoroughness, before getting up with the efficiency of someone who understood that complaining and complying were not mutually exclusive. Henry let Ruth dress him in his best shirt without protest, which told her more than anything else could have about what he understood of the day.
"Are you scared?" Josie asked at breakfast directly, the way she asked everything. "A little," Ruth said. "Are we going to win?" "We're going to tell the truth," Ruth said. "And the truth is on our side. That's what winning looks like, Josie. Not a performance. The truth." Josie considered this. What if the judge doesn't like the truth? Then we find a way to say it that he can hear. Ruth set down her coffee cup. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to speak clearly, and we're going to tell him exactly who we are and let him see us. She looked at all three of them. You don't have to be anything other than yourselves. That's the whole job. Clara nodded once. Henry ate his toast. Josie said, "I can do that. I'm very good at being myself," which made Clara almost smile. Will Hargrove was waiting outside Briggs's feed store when they came down. He was dressed in his Sunday clothes, dark coat, clean hat, and he stood with the particular stillness Ruth had come to think of as simply how he occupied space. Like a man who had learned that standing still was its own kind of statement. Dorothy Marsh was beside him, and beside Dorothy stood Reverend Cole and Ed Harmon, and, to Ruth's considerable surprise, Nora Finch, who was wearing her best dress and had her dark hair pinned back and was holding a folded piece of paper with both hands. Ruth stopped on the bottom step. She looked at all of them. "What is this?" she said. "Character witnesses," Dorothy said, in the tone she used for things that should be obvious. "We're coming to Helena." "Dorothy, the school!" "Ed's wife is watching the school today. She taught for 2 years in Billings. The children will be fine." Dorothy straightened her coat. "We're coming, Ruth. That's not a discussion." Ruth looked at Will. He looked back at her without apology or explanation, just with that steady, dark gaze that said he'd made a decision and was comfortable with it. She looked at Nora Finch. "Why are you here?" she asked, not unkindly. Nora held up the folded paper. "I wrote a statement," she said, "about what you did for me. About what you said about knowing things not having anything to do with being a girl." Her voice was careful, but her eyes were direct. "Dorothy said the judge might want to hear from a student. I volunteered." Ruth opened her mouth and found she had nothing to say that was adequate to the moment. She closed it again. "All right," she said. "Let's go." The stage to Helena took 4 hours. They filled it completely. Ruth and the 3 children, Will and Dorothy, Reverend Cole, Nora Finch, and Ed Harmon, who had decided at the last minute that someone should represent the business community, and he was the logical choice. Arthur Calloway had taken a private coach the day before. Ruth had known he would. It was the kind of detail that said everything about the difference between them. One side arriving in a hired coach the evening before to be settled and rested. The other side cramped into a stage at dawn, elbows touching, breathing each other's air. She found she didn't mind. Josie fell asleep against Will's arm somewhere past the first hour, which seemed to surprise him considerably. He went very still, in the careful way of a man who didn't want to disturb a sleeping child, and was also, perhaps, not entirely sure what to do with one. Ruth watched him look down at Josie's sleeping face with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone encountering something they had stopped expecting to want, and finding they wanted it anyway. He looked up and found Ruth watching him. Neither of them said anything, but something passed between them in that stage on the Helena Road. Something quiet and real that didn't require words. Henry, wedged between Ruth and the wall of the stage, with his coat pulled up, said quietly, "Mr. Hargrove, the mayor had a dream last Tuesday. Lester said horses do that." "They do," Will said. "What did they dream about?" "Running, mostly. Wide open ground." Henry thought about this. "I dream about that too," he said.
Not horses, just running, wide open. He looked at the window. Silver Creek has that, all around it, wide open. It does, Will said. I like it, Henry said, and closed his eyes. Ruth pressed her lips together and looked out the window at the Montana landscape rolling past in its winter whites and grays, and she thought, these are my children, and they are not going anywhere. The Helena Courthouse was a stone building that believed in its own importance, which most courthouses did.
Ruth had been inside it once before, on the other side of the argument, standing across from Arthur Calloway and a judge who had given her 30 days she hadn't used. The building looked exactly the same. She felt entirely different standing in front of it. Judge Warren Aldous was in his 60s, with a careful face and the measured speech of a man who had learned early that the words a judge used in a courtroom became the words people remembered for the rest of their lives. He looked at the assembled group filing into his courtroom. Ruth and her 3 children, Will, Dorothy, Reverend Cole, Ed Harmon, Nora Finch. And then he looked at Arthur Calloway, sitting alone at the opposite table with his lawyer. And Ruth saw the calculation happening behind the judge's eyes. The hearing opened with Arthur's lawyer presenting the original petition, the argument for instability, for resources, for the Calloway family's capacity to provide. It was competently done. The lawyer had a smooth delivery and the kind of reasonable-sounding logic that could make wrong things sound like common sense. Ruth sat straight and listened and let none of it show on her face. Then Will Hargrove stood. He did not use notes. He had told Ruth the night before that notes made a man look like he was reciting rather than saying, and what a judge needed to hear was someone saying something real. He stood in front of Judge Aldous and spoke with the plain clarity of a man who had spent 6 years on a bench himself and knew exactly which details a judge weighted and which ones he didn't. He spoke about Ruth's classroom, specific observations, specific students, specific evidence of learning. He spoke about the community-written statements, presenting Dorothy's letter, Reverend Cole's, his own. He spoke about territorial custody law and the principle that flight from an untenable situation was not equivalent to unfitness, and that the original Helena proceeding had failed to account for the circumstances driving Ruth's departure. He spoke about Henry and the gray mare. He did not present it as a legal argument. He presented it as a fact about a child. A fact about who Henry Calloway was, what he needed, what he had found in 4 weeks in Silver Creek that he had clearly not had in 5 years in Helena. He said it plainly, and he let it stand. Judge Aldous listened to all of it without expression. Then Arthur Calloway's lawyer called Arthur to speak, and Arthur stood up, and for a moment Ruth held herself very still, because even knowing what Arthur had said to her in the schoolhouse, knowing what he'd seen on Friday morning, a man's intentions and a man's actions in a courtroom were sometimes separated by a considerable distance. Arthur looked at his lawyer. He looked at the judge. He put his hands flat on the railing in front of him and said, "I'd like to amend my testimony, Your Honor." The lawyer's head turned sharply. "Mr. Calloway, I'd like to amend my testimony," Arthur said again, steadily. "I filed this petition because I believed I was acting in these children's best interest. I have spent 3 weeks in Silver Creek observing Mrs. Calloway and her family, and I am prepared to state under oath that my original assessment was incorrect." He paused. "Those children are exactly where they should be, with their mother, in the community she has built for them. I should not have filed this petition, and I am withdrawing my support for it." The silence in the courtroom lasted perhaps 5 seconds. It felt longer. Arthur's lawyer leaned toward him and said something low and urgent. Arthur shook his head once, the same kind of small, decisive headshake that Clara used, and Ruth had a sudden strange understanding that this was not the first time Arthur Calloway had disagreed with George about something, and had the backbone to say so. It was simply the first time he'd disagreed about her. Judge Aldous looked at Arthur for a long moment. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "you understand that withdrawing your support does not automatically conclude this proceeding. This court makes its own determination." "I understand," Arthur said. "I'm telling you what I observed. The determination is yours." "Sit down," the judge said. He sat. Judge Aldous looked at Ruth. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I'd like to speak with your oldest daughter, privately, in my chambers. Is that acceptable?" Ruth turned to Clara, who was sitting very straight in the first row of the gallery, with Josie on one side and Henry on the other. Clara met her eyes. "It's your choice," Ruth said. "Entirely your choice." Clara looked at the judge. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'd like that." They were in chambers for 18 minutes. Ruth knew because she watched the clock on the courtroom wall and counted every minute with the focused intensity of a person who needed something to do with her hands. Will sat beside her and did not speak and did not touch her, but his presence beside her was the solid, specific thing she'd come to rely on in the past weeks. The simple fact of a person who had decided to be there and intended to stay decided. Dorothy sat on Ruth's other side. At minute 11, she reached over and put her hand over Ruth's and squeezed once and let go. Ruth held on to that squeeze for the remaining 7 minutes. When Clara came back out of chambers, she walked directly to Ruth and sat down and said quietly, "He asked me what I wanted, and I told him." "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Clara said. "Like you said." Judge Aldous returned to the bench. He looked at the room. He looked at his papers. He was quiet for long enough that Ruth felt every heartbeat separately. "This court has reviewed all submitted materials," he said, "and has conducted a private interview with the eldest child, whose preference is clear and whose manner of expressing that preference indicates a child making a genuine and considered choice rather than a coached one." He set down the papers. "This court finds that Ruth Calloway has demonstrated, in 4 weeks in Silver Creek, Montana territory, sufficient evidence of stability, community integration, professional competence, and parental fitness to meet the threshold required for full maternal custody of Clara, Josephine, and Henry Calloway." He looked at Arthur. "The Calloway family's petition is dismissed. Full custody is granted to the mother. This matter is closed." The gavel came down. Ruth heard it from a strange distance, like a sound heard through water. Then Josie made a sound beside her that was not quite a word, and threw both arms around Ruth's neck with the force of a child who had been sitting still for 4 hours and could not contain herself one more second. Henry pressed into Ruth's side. Clara put her forehead against Ruth's shoulder and held very still. Ruth held all 3 of them. She held them the way she had held them in the wagon on the Montana flats, in the dark, listening to the wind. But this time, not with the desperate grip of someone afraid of losing what she held. With something that felt entirely different. With the open-handed certainty of someone who had been told, in the clearest possible terms, that what she held was hers. She looked over Josie's head and found Will Hargrove watching her from 2 feet away, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the steady, contained quality he usually wore, but something open. Something that looked like a man who had just watched something he'd almost stopped hoping for happen in front of his eyes. She reached out her hand. He took it without hesitation. Dorothy Marsh, who was not a woman given to displays, blew her nose into her handkerchief with impressive decisiveness, and then looked around the room as if daring anyone to comment. On the steps of the courthouse, in the January cold, with Helena spread out around them and the mountains white in the distance, Arthur Calloway approached Ruth alone. His lawyer had already gone. He stood in front of her with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had reached the end of something and was not entirely sure what came next. "I am sorry," he said. "For what it's worth now." Ruth looked at him. She thought about what forgiveness was. Not the large, cinematic kind, not the kind that erased things, but the quiet, ordinary kind that simply meant, I am not going to spend my life being angry at you, because I need that energy for better things. "It's worth something," she said. "Not everything, but something." He nodded. "If the children ever—" He stopped, started again. "If you ever thought it was appropriate for them to know their father's family, I would welcome that. On whatever terms you set." He paused. "Josie is very funny," he said. "George never mentioned that." "I know," Ruth said. "I know he didn't." He left. Ruth watched him go down the courthouse steps and turn onto the Helena Street, and she felt the last of the 8-month wait shift. Not disappear. It didn't disappear. Some weights became part of the architecture of a person, and she understood that now. But shift. Settle differently. Become something she was carrying by choice, rather than something she was buried under. Will appeared at her shoulder. "Ready to go home?" he said. Home. The word landed in Ruth's chest like a coal set gently down, warm and steady and exactly the right size for the space it filled. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." The stage back to Silver Creek left at 2 o'clock. By the time they were an hour out of Helena, the children were asleep. Henry against Ruth's arm, Josie against Will's again, with the complete, unconscious comfort of a child who had decided this was a reliable shoulder. And Clara, upright and still in the corner, asleep with the dignity of a 12-year-old who would not admit to being tired, but had run out of the ability to stay awake. Dorothy and Reverend Cole talked quietly across from them. Nora Finch was reading a book she'd borrowed from Ruth's bag. Ed Harmon was asleep with his hat over his face. Will said, very quietly, "Henry told me on Tuesday that the mayor's real name shouldn't be whatever Lester calls her. He said she told him her actual name." Ruth looked at him. "What did she tell him?" "He wouldn't say. He said it was between them." Something moved in Will's face, that almost smile that she'd come to watch for, that lived just at the corner of his expression. "He's going to be something, that boy." "He already is something," Ruth said. "I know." He paused. "All three of them are." He looked at her. "You did that." "I had help," she said. "Not for most of it." "No," she agreed. "Not for most of it." The stage rolled through the Montana afternoon, through country that was white and vast and indifferent to human concerns in the way that large landscapes were. And Ruth looked out at it and thought about the woman who had driven into Silver Creek on a Tuesday in December, counting her children like things likely to be taken. She thought about $17.40 and 3 peppermints on a mercantile counter. She thought about a stovepipe collar and the gray mare and a 16-year-old girl who spelled Montana wrong and drew a star next to the correction. She thought about a man who fixed things rather than leaving them broken, and who had told her, in a stable that smelled of hay and cold leather, that she deserved to know something true before they walked into a courtroom together. "Will," she said. He looked at her. "You said after January 14th you'd ask me whatever you were thinking about asking me." "I did say that." "It's after January 14th. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Silver Creek was still 2 hours away. Around them, everyone else was asleep or absorbed. The stage moved through the winter afternoon with the steady rhythm of something going home. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "I know. I don't need one." He looked at her steadily. "I want to build something," he said. "Something real. Something that doesn't need to be hidden or protected or braced for loss." He paused. "With you, if you want that." Ruth looked at this man, this careful, honest,
quietly stubborn man who had fixed her stovepipe and let her son talk to a horse, and stood up in a courtroom and said the things that needed saying, without notes, without performance, without anything except the plain conviction that truth stated clearly was its own most powerful argument. "I want that," she said. "I want exactly that." He reached over, careful not to disturb Henry sleeping against her arm, and took her hand. He held it the way he did everything, firmly, without drama, like a man who had made a decision and intended to keep it. They rode the last 2 hours to Silver Creek like that, hand in hand in the winter stage, with 3 children sleeping around them and Montana rolling past the windows in its enormous silence. And when the stage finally turned onto Silver Creek's main street, and Ruth saw the lamplight in the schoolhouse window, because Ed Harmon's wife had left a lamp burning, a small, deliberate kindness, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long, she had almost forgotten it was something a person could feel. She felt safe. Completely, genuinely, down to the bone safe. Not because danger no longer existed in the world. It did. It always would. Not because everything was resolved and nothing could hurt her anymore. But because she had stood still when everything in her wanted to run. And she had fought for the things that mattered. And she had let people stand beside her. And they had stood. And this was home. This small Montana town, with its warped blackboard and difficult stovepipe, its 14 students and one determined 16-year-old who wanted to know things, its horse that Henry talked to in a language only the 2 of them understood. This was home, and it had been home since the moment she'd driven into it on a Tuesday in December, and looked at her 3 children and counted them, and found all 3. Dorothy Marsh was first off the stage. She looked up at the lamplight in the schoolhouse window, and then she looked at Ruth and said, "Monday, 8 o'clock. Don't be late." Which was Dorothy's way of saying, "You belong here. You always will. Welcome back." Ruth smiled. "I'm never late," she said. "No," Dorothy agreed. "You're not." And she walked off into Silver Creek like a woman who had done a day's work and was satisfied with it. Ruth stood on the frozen street with Henry on her hip and Clara's hand in hers, and Josie pressed against her side, and Will Hargrove standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. She stood there for a moment and looked at the town, its lit windows, its smoke-trailing chimneys, the mountains enormous and white at its back, the sky above it going from gray to the dark blue of a Montana winter evening. She had come here with $17 and a lie and 3 children, and the desperate hope that no one would ask too many questions. She was standing here now with her children named and her name cleared, and a community that had put 7 people on a stage to Helena to say she was worth standing beside. She was Ruth Calloway. She was a mother and a teacher, and a woman who drove through blizzards when the thing at the other end was worth driving through blizzards for. She was someone who had been broken and had rebuilt herself with better materials. She was someone who had learned, finally, at the end of a very long road, that standing still took more courage than any amount of running, and that the ground you stood on mattered just as much as how long you could hold your position on it. She had found her ground, right here, in Silver Creek, Montana, in the winter of 1886, with snow on the street and lamplight in the schoolhouse window, and 3 children who were hers. She was not going anywhere. She was already home.